start off, I just wanted to sort of restate the context of the article and what it seems like Sponberg is interested in doing in general, just looking at the development of Yogācāra thought, looking at the way it changes over time. And in this article specifically, he's mostly interested in looking at Kuei-ji, who was Xuanzang's disciple. But before he talks about Kuei-ji in this article, he, in his sort of introductory section of his paper, he presents these two models of the doctrine of the three natures at different periods in Yogācāra thought. And what he's doing basically is this first model, the pivotal model, this is his sort of, he calls it his tentative periodization of Yogācāra. What this first model comes from is the classical period. This model is from the Mahayana Sangraha, which is a Sangha. And then this progressive model, he doesn't really give a specific source. It's sort of a compilation of later East Asian Yogācāra thought. He gives the Hoso school as the Japanese Yogācāra school as he mentions it when he's talking about the sources for this model. And Kuei-ji is going to fall in between these two. So that's the basic context of the paper. The pivotal model presents the three natures as aspects of, he says it's three interrelated aspects of phenomenal existence. So there's no talk of the three natures as being a sort of rubric of classification of phenomena. You know, everything has these three natures. It's not that you can classify phenomena in one of the three. Another distinctive, or I think an important feature of this model is that, well, which we'll get into, is that the primary, if you had to choose what's really sort of the most important of the three natures here, in a sense, it's the dependent nature. I mean, basically, there are dependent natures, and then we can either impute something on them, or we can see them in their true aspects, the consummate aspect. And it's from making that shift from the imaginary to the consummate that we are enlightened. We see into things, see into the true nature of things. And the progressive model, rather than starting with a discussion of the dependent nature, starts with a discussion of the imaginary nature. And it, at least the way Sponberg talks about it, it's a model of a progression of practice. You start out, caught up in imaginary natures, and then you sort of see through them, and in transcending them, talks about this language of transcendence. You move on to the dependent, and then from there, finally, to the consummate. So the primary difference between these two is this reversal of role of the dependent and the imaginary natures. In the pivotal model, you don't really, you don't leave it behind. In fact, he cites a quotation from Xuanzang, who's commenting on
what's the it that you don't leave behind?
The dependent nature is not left behind in the pivotal model, whereas in the progressive it is. And one verse that he cites, which sort of encapsulates this in a nice way, is a verse from Xuanzang, who's commenting on the Mahayana Sangraha. And he says, if a dependent did not exist, the consummate would not exist. So it's very clear here. And so Sponberg says the pivotal model resolves, actually this is not a direct quote, but this is a summary of a passage of his. The The pivotal model resolves the apparent duality of samsara and nirvana through an experience of true phenomenality. Through a transformational shift, the phenomenal world is seen in its purity, but is still left intact, profoundly revalorized in one's experience. The progressive model, on the other hand, rejects this phenomenality, which is ultimately illusory, in favor of the pure, which is truly real. In other words, the consummate is what we prefer.
From the point of view of Buddhahood, in Tsong-kha-pa's system, you are left with seeing these two simultaneously, right? And as far as direct perception prior to that goes, you see just C or D, right? Prior to Buddha.
From Tsong-kha-pa's perspective?
Yeah.
Is this
Yeah.
a general perspective or just in mind only?
No, in mind only.
In mind
Well, it's a general also.
only. Okay.
In terms of direct perception. But I think this line about the dependent natures being profoundly revalorized would hold true, never mind Buddhahood, for any other level too. Even if you're a meditative equipoise and you merely saw the consummate nature, when you rose from it, dependent natures, even if you're not still seeing the consummate nature directly, would be profoundly revalorized. And the same is true at the level of inference of the consummate nature. It's probably true also at the level of yijia, of correctly assuming consciousness. And even it's said that when you have doubt tending to the fact, that you get, shaken up. That sentence sounds like it holds wherever you look.
Okay. I think Tsong-kha-pa would agree that, without the dependent nature, you can't have the consummate nature. But on the other hand, he doesn't really speak of, maybe it's just because he doesn't speak in this language, but I don't recall him speaking of the dependent nature having these two aspects. He doesn't really talk about this shift so much, from what I can recall. But again,
Well, there's that statement about if the dependent nature did not exist, meaning exist by way of its own character, then there would be no basis for for imputational words, which means that which is imputed by words, or of the thoroughly established nature. But if you ask, does the dependent nature have the imputational nature, the Meikyu-gunda? That's difficult to answer, right?
Yeah.
Is it the base of misimagining that Meikyu-gunda? Yes. Does it have it? I almost have to say no.
yeah, I think, rather than speaking of a shift from one aspect of the dependent nature to another, from the imaginary to the consummate, Tsong-kha-pa talks more of, the consummate being the absence of, what you were just saying, exactly. Two different ways of speaking about it, and one of the problems, I think, in really comparing, one thing we have to keep in mind as we're comparing Sponberg with Tsong-kha-pa, which I pointed out at the beginning here, is that there's really not a very technical analysis in this. He doesn't, for one thing, he's using different phrases in different ways than Tsong-kha-pa does. He's also, I don't get the sense he's using them as systematically.
Yes, I was wondering as I was reading it, whether this was an amalgam of Madhyamaka and Yogācāra, and who did the amalgamation.
If the pivotal model.
Yeah, I mean, it's...
I don't know. He says that he bases his presentation of the pivotal model on the Mahayana Sangha, which is a
And
separate-
doesn't systematically quote it.
No, it doesn't really quote it. It's-
See, I would think you could take Tsong-kha-pa's writing in two ways, epistemological and ontological. And this is a mixture of the two. What's taught first in Tsong-khapa's system?
Well,
What does Buddha teach first among the three natures?
it speaks of the dependent nature first.
Yeah, it would be even later on that, that there would be qualms about what was taught in the middle wheel, and somebody would wonder, why did you teach that all phenomena natureless? Then he mentions the naturelessness in terms of character first. But otherwise, as you said, he teaches the dependent nature first, teaches it first. So in terms of practice, one pays attention to the dependent nature first.
Right. Let's see.
There's no way around that.
Yeah. I don't know, I just get the sense that for us to compare Tsong-kha-pa, what Tsong-kha-pa starts with and what these models start with, we might be comparing things that I think there are different contexts.
Yes, and we need to find out what those contexts are.
Yeah.
It's like, you don't want to, in one sense, you don't want to put down this one or that one,
Right.
and at least until you understand thoroughly where they're coming from.
Right.
And the Sanghita Sutra is super clear, as that quote that I repeat a few times in Reflections on Reality, that the dependent natures are taught first in order to draw people into virtue, to see that current feelings and so forth arise in dependence upon cause conditions, and that these are virtue and non-virtue, and therefore will practice virtue and non-virtue. Imputational nature and thoroughly established nature are taught. It says, it just puts them together, are taught second. And in a way you can see it identifying the object of negation and identifying the negative of that object of negation. But Tsong-kha-pa never mentions this. This is me.
He never mentions what?
He never mentions this particular quote, that other powered natures are taught first. This is, okay.
There's a quote I just
I
found
would
reading
love to
for
have
today.
it. Yes.
Where you said on page 342, citing Tsong-kha-pa, the Sutra Unraveling the Thought says that if one sees other powered natures as without the nature of the character of the imputational nature, those are overcome in that order. So you start with the other powered and then...
That's not the particular one I was referring to, but I'd be most happy if you could.
Oh.
So you get improper conception of the imputational nature in other powered natures. That leads to afflictive emotions, and that leads to karma. Therefore, when you see other powered natures as without the nature of the imputational character, you overcome what? What does in that order mean? Actually, I think it should be spelled out clearly. Those means afflictive emotions and karma that arise from them are overcome in that same order. So you start with a misconception that leads to these two things. You start with a correct perception that then undermines these two things in the same order.
I see. That's helpful, because when I was reading that, it says those are overcome.
Yeah.
I was thinking it
Me
reminded
too.
me of this progressive model where you reject things.
You reject the other power natures,
it
right?
really
Yeah,
confused me.
yeah.
So,
But in one sense, the other what I was trying to say is the other power of nature is overcome when you consider if the chief other power of nature is the misconception.
Yeah, or even that the chief other powered natures are impure.
Right.
You don't overcome pure ones.
Right.
Well, you caused me to, turn and see. But that doesn't seem to be what the paragraph is about. Let's see, we have the sutra just above. Superimposing, then sentient beings designate their minds have thoroughly infused, manifestly conceive other powered natures, right? And thoroughly established natures to be of the character of the imputational nature. This is actually, I think, counter Tsong-kha-pa. Because, for instance, he accuses the Jonangas of saying, who would misconceive that the thoroughly established nature is the imputational nature? Misconceive it as the imputational nature. What you're misconceiving are these things. Therefore, you have to take these things as your bases of emptiness and see them as devoid of the imputational nature. But the sutra itself does say, at least this once, if not a couple more times, that it's other powered natures and thoroughly established natures. We seem to leave room for both Tsongkha system and the Jonangba system. Due to the cause in the future, other powered natures are thoroughly generated, which means impure. On that basis, they control it by action. So it looks as if all of them are, and they are thoroughly fictions of action Okay, in Reflections on Reality, on page 282, at the bottom, is where Buddha explains that the teaching of other powered natures is not sufficient, and that therefore the naturelessness in terms of character and the naturelessness in terms of the ultimate need to be taught. Okay, now, 254 it says, Paramartha Samudgata, I teach doctrines concerning non-natures in terms of production, that means other powered natures, to those beings who from the start have not generated roots of virtue, who have not purified the obstructions, who have not ripened their continuums, and who do not have much belief, and who have not achieved the collections of merit and wisdom. These beings, having heard these doctrines understood about the other powered natures, discriminate compositional phenomena which are dependent arisings as impermanent, and discriminate them as just unstable, unworthy of confidence, and as having a nature of change, whereupon they develop fear and discouragement with respect to all compositional phenomena. Having developed fear and discouragement, they turn away from ill deeds. They do not commit any ill deeds, and they resort to virtue. Due to resorting to virtue, they generate roots of virtue that were not previously generated, purify obstructions that were not purified, and also ripen their continuums which were not ripened. On that basis, they have much belief and they achieve the collections of wisdom. So then the last part of that gets repeated on 280, and then on 282, which takes up from there, indeed they have achieved beneficial forces ranging from generation of roots of virtue to collections of merit and wisdom, but because they do not understand as they really are the two aspects, the naturelessness in terms of character and the naturelessness in terms of the ultimate, with respect to these non-natures in terms of production, meaning they don't understand imputational natures and thoroughly established natures with respect to other powered natures, They do not develop discouragement toward all compositional phenomena. They do not become thoroughly separated from desire, and they do not become completely released. In other words, there's another phase to be taught. They do not become completely released from the thorough afflictions that are the afflictive emotions. They do not become completely released from the thorough afflictions that are actions. And they also do not become completely released from the thorough afflictions that are births. Therefore, the one gone thus also teaches them doctrines concerning the naturelessness in terms of character and the ultimate naturelessness. You see, they're lumped together. It was very interesting. You know, you would think it would be staged. I mean, ultimate naturalness does come second in this group of two, but the sutra doesn't gradually lay them out. Why? In order that those beings become thoroughly discouraged with respect to all compositional phenomena, become thoroughly separated, thoroughly passed beyond, thoroughly passed beyond thorough afflictions. Because, hearing these doctrines, they do not conceive other powered natures to have the character of the imputational nature. They believe in distinguished non-natures in terms of production, that is to say, other powered natures, to be without the nature of character and without the nature of the ultimate. That means that they are not the ultimate. That first meaning of ultimate naturelessness, which just means that these things are not the ultimate, whereupon they realize them just as they are, which then means the true ultimate naturelessness. So, I don't know where I got turned on to this, whether it was from somewhere in Guntang's commentary or whether it was just from reading it with Powers, the whole of the sutra. But this was my breakthrough to understand what was going on in the series in which the three natures are taught, as opposed to the series in which the three, the basis in which Buddha indicates the basis in his thought when he talked about naturelessness. As opposed, that was crucial to me. I mean, it all was like nonsense until that. Now, one has to say that Tsong-kha-pa never mentions this. So even when we're talking about Tsong-kha-pa, here we have to say, as Hopkins sees it, I think it's so common in Gelugpa that, in Lamrim, that first you practice virtue, first you understand dependent arising, non-virtues to be avoided, virtues to be adopted in practice. This is the whole theory of beings of low capacity, and even middling capacity. But to achieve the level of being middling capacity, then you have to identify some object of negation and its emptiness. But now, this is all to lead to, what is this? This progressive model, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's first you're identifying, what are you doing in the second? You've passed beyond the imputational nature?
Yeah, there's, in a way, it's just it's a progression of realizations in practice. And he says that the imputational level is the first superficial level of existence, the level at which, in our delusion, we cling to ourself and to things as truly existing. Nothing by truly existing, he doesn't.
So to bring it over to Tsong-kha-pa's language, we merely need to, Tsong-kha was talking about an ontological thing, setup, right? But then you can say misconceiving imputational natures, understanding dependent natures, right? And, just add some epistemological term to it. And certainly we start embedded, thoroughly embedded in our misconceptions, gross and subtle, right? So what is this first level? Is it realization of the imputational nature as imputational, or is it that we're sunk in this misconception?
I think it's the latter. I think it's,
We're sunk in it.
yeah, that we're sort of stuck with it, and that there's something else. That's when you make the transition. Is the sense I have from this. I guess it's realization of the dependent nature in a sense. Realization that the dependent nature is not the imputational nature.
Right. That it's dependent on causes and conditions.
Yeah, which is his meaning,
Right.
which gets you out of the imputational nature. So then how do you get to the last stage?
In the last stage,
If to move to the, I'll just say it, if to move to the dependent nature phase, you undermine the imputational phase, right? Then how do you move to the consummate phase?
while dependent natures are more real than imaginary natures, they are still impermanent, he says. The consummate nature is the pure, unchanging, ultimate thusness of all being beyond the impermanence of the dependent nature.
Oh, so it's beyond the impermanence.
Yeah, you reject,
So the,
yeah, you reject the lower ones. And you end up, the consummate and the dependent nature are separate in this model.
so the object of negation, the gakja that you're trying to deal with is, what is it, permanence on the first level, impermanence on the second level?
It seems like it, yeah. It doesn't ever explicitly say that, but
And you can see the translation consummate means like finished, completed,
yeah.
rather than ontologically something that was already there. Or is it? Or at least it's epistemically oriented rather than ontologically oriented. What the ontology is behind this is another matter. How you draw that chart. So in Tsong-kha-pa's system, if we turned his view of the three natures into an epistemic movement, we would be sunk in a gross level of imputational natures, and through being taught the dependency of dependent natures, we would relieve ourselves of being sunk in some of the more gross misconceptions. But then to pass epistemically to the so-called level of the thoroughly established nature, one needs to realize the absence of a subtle imputation, megukunda, right? Something like that. And certainly his system is calling for an epistemic change, right? I mean, that's what drives it. What about the other one? More on this one? This is so fruitful to think of it this way, rather than thinking of it entirely in different, fields. And you've done a great job. Being willing to draw the comparisons, which is exactly what we need. So I can see epistemically how one moves from misconception of that Meguganda exists, right, to the realization of the consummate nature by realizing that the Meguganda don't exist. If you took these as epistemic movements only. Now, Tsong-kha-pa clearly faces this question with regard to the misconception that objects are he has somebody raising a qualm in saying, oh, well, this just would apply to conceptual consciousness, right? So often people think that what Buddhism is talking about is overcoming just conceptuality.
So
Yeah, and what about impermanence too? I mean, realizing that dependent natures are impermanent. And so what you're doing when you move to the consummate nature is you're realizing that there is some other realm that is permanent,
I get, yeah, I mean,
which would be more like the accusations that Tsong-kha-pa makes against the Jonangas of a Shendong theory. You know, that there's this realm that's entirely separate from the dependent and imputation. In Tsong-kha-pa's own system, when you perceive the thoroughly established nature, you don't perceive anything else, unless you're a Buddha.
Well, Sponberg talks about a Yogācāra doctrine of two cognitions, one that happens at the moment of enlightenment, when you're seeing the consummate, and then there's a subsequent cognition, which is what helps or what allows bodhisattvas to come back in the world and engage with objects.
At the enlightenment of a Buddha?
Well, first, he doesn't
Or-
say the enlightenment of a Buddha. I don't think he just says at the moment of enlightenment.
Yeah, because sometimes words for enlightenment are used for direct
Different
perception, and so that will be in the path of seeing. And so you're it's the so-called in meditative equipoise and out of meditative equipoise difference. And what happens at Buddhahood is that the two are, there is no time lag. They occur simultaneously. It's so hard to know when people write things, whether they're confused or about their sources, or whether you're dealing with the actual system, whether Hopkins just hasn't mucked it up, for instance. Yeah, it's the big issue. What is reality? And not big issue in the sense of even this one's right and that one's wrong, but to see the plethora of opinions, to be stimulated into understanding deeper and deeper what may be negated in reality. It's a very important matter and something that's crucial for all of us. And although I may make a joke that, oh, well, anybody can understand that if you say gold, you don't have gold, our confusion of words and objects is so severe that it's a tremendous hurdle to overcome. It's just a question of, is this the hurdle that they're talking about in the end? And, one practices doesn't necessarily practice on the highest level. I've had a hard time, otherwise I guess I would be liberated a long time ago. You can write this stuff. George's talk was so helpful, wasn't it?
Very much
Just
so.
fabulous. And I like this, Madhyamaka from the point of view of experience and Madhyamaka from the point of view of reasoning within the same system. That there's certain things you could say from the point of view of experience that you wouldn't say from the point of view of reasoning, and the other way around.
Didn't you talk about something like that in the Madhyamaka class, like the mode of delineating emptiness from
Yeah.
Dawa?
Shi dawa doniten la pe sultan, ringo dawa doniten.
Is that what he was talking about?
Well, he was doing, he didn't remember clearly, but he was saying, now, this is what he thought it might be. And, after you say things and write too much in English, you lose them, and that's where your memory starts resigning. This is what he thought it was. You see, a Madhyamaka, like Onducheva from the point of view of experience, a Madhyamaka from the point of view of reasoning. Now the top one is, Toniden Bepso means mode of delineating emptiness. Shida, in terms of a, basal view, but it's like setting up the two truths and talking about a gakcha, and that this table is the basis of like an imputational nature, and the absence of that imputational nature in it is the thoroughly established nature. Whereas Ringo Dao Doni Deno Bepso, the manner or mode of delineating emptiness, I may have left out some syllable there, which is how it appears to Rigpa. Now this is not the Nyingma Rigpa, but the Rigpa of, you could say the Rigpa of Rikshe, or the Rigpa of direct cognition of emptiness. How it looks. And for that you can say, Sup me, Ja me, Ti me, Ro me, Rekja me, You can say all of those without any qualification. You don't have to say Ranshingi Medo for Madhyama, for Prasangika. You don't have to have any qualification, because these things are non-existent for that consciousness. That doesn't mean they're non-existent, but that's all. You're saying what this consciousness looks like. You're trying to draw people into reality through experiencing that consciousness, talking about the consciousness, rather than talking about the ontological setup. And it's a very attractive way to talk about reality from the point of view of the consciousness. That nothing else appears except emptiness, or so therefore no form, no sound, etc. And that's one way of taking the heart sutra. That part of the heart sutra. So, what has the reading been set up for next time? Yes, it has. It's the rest of the two types of emptiness. How'd you find that?
Yes, you took this.
Oh, doesn't it crown it?
Yeah,
Isn't it beautiful?
excellent.
And isn't it amazing? It's only in oral teaching.
Yeah.